All right, welcome back to another episode of Podcast PD. It is Sunday,
No, it's not.
Wow,
It's not.
February.
it's not.
It's not.
Can we go back to
We all
February
wish we could
1st?
go back to February, I guess, right? It is Sunday, April 26th, 2020. It's 8:30 p.m. and I am joined by my Podcast PD compadres, AJ Bianco, Stacey Lindas, and our special guest this evening, David Frangiosa. AJ, Stacey, how are you?
Doing well, Chris. I mean, quarantine is definitely catching up on us. We still think it's February. So
Yeah, right.
Although we
My
weren't in
bad.
quarantine in February, so
we were
there's
not.
that.
We're actually living life and like enjoying things.
I think I saw a movie in February. Yeah.
So that's something I was going to ask because somebody gave us a gift card to a movie, and I made a comment to Jamie. Like it wasn't supposed to be like for now. Like, hey, go to a movie. It was like here for the future. I'm like, yeah, I won't be going to a movie for about 5 years. So,
Yeah, right.
5 years?
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere. I'm staying in my house.
Yeah, I only recently saw an article about like when AMC theaters are going to start to reopen movie theaters.
If they don't go bankrupt before then.
Yeah, true.
But how are you, Chris? Everything good? Happy Sunday. Happy record
Everything
day.
is good. Happy
Yeah.
Sunday. I gave myself a haircut today and want to go over and check out the replay. If you're listening to the audio version of this, go back and check it out. I didn't have to, shave it all off.
Yeah, your
No
haircut
offense,
went
David.
better.
No,
than
no
mine.
offense.
Nah, none taken.
Stacey, how are you?
I'm doing all right. I have Wi-Fi, so I'll be starting tomorrow or this week with a better situation than I had last week. And sorry I left so abruptly. My phone died because charging things was not my priority last Sunday. And yeah,
It
life's
was
good.
only after about maybe 5 minutes after you were not on the broadcast anymore did I say to AJ, "Where'd Stacey go?"
Yeah. Yep.
Like,
It was
we realized
crackling.
we were
It was going in and out. I don't know if it affected the audio because I haven't listened yet, but on my end, it was really hard to hear everybody anyway. So
I love
it
how
kind
you
of
say
worked out.
you haven't listened yet. You never listen to any episodes.
I know, but there's hope, right?
We're not part of the 6,072 that you have.
No, it's not that many.
Sorry.
Yeah.
6,071.
Yeah, right.
No.
Hello to Al Spiegel out in the chat. If you're joining us on YouTube, make sure you drop a hello where you're coming to us from. And we are also live streaming this to Twitter/Periscope. So if you're watching on your mobile phone while you're driving, what are you doing? Please pull over.
Driving.
Who knows if
Who's doing
people are watching while they're driving on their phones?
I just wonder who's driving at 8:30 at night.
You can drive anywhere you want.
Yeah, you don't have to stop driving.
Hey, here's
People
our first
aren't driving
Periscope
anywhere.
comment. What is up, Tim? It's under 2,000, isn't it, Stacey? Checking in on the Periscope. Nice.
It is at exactly 2,000, Tim. Are you spying on my phone?
What?
It's at 2,000.
2,000. You were at no. Come
One
on,
day,
you're
I know, I
going
was at
up.
1977 last week.
Oh my
I
god.
get a lot in a day and I'm not driving anywhere.
Understood. All right.
You could get out and take pictures of flamingos, but you can't listen to podcasts.
No, because I can't listen to podcasts when I run. I listen to music. You like my flamingo pictures?
Yes, those are some really great photos. Nice, high color, bright, beautiful, sunny day.
I'm
was
not,
nice.
I'm not familiar with these flamingos.
Well, she's at iRunTech on Instagram. Go check it out.
They also show up on my Facebook.
I was gonna say Stacey's stuff doesn't really come across my Instagram. I gotta be honest with you.
It's all good. I'm not on Instagram, but for like once a week when I go look for the new flamboyance, it's not a flock of flamingos. I just found out from one of my Facebook friends that it's a flamboyance, which just seems so appropriate for a pink bird with like such long legs. It's very flamboyant.
I'm hearing all the quotes of like Robin Williams from The Birdcage. Just any like Marsha Grant. I'm just hearing flamboyance and
Wow, I haven't seen that in a long time.
flamingos.
neither.
Great movie.
You went back to Birdcage. Wow, that's awesome.
That's
I did.
beautiful.
Well,
Anyway,
nothing from Aladdin seemed okay. All right, yeah. Go ahead, Stacey. Move it on.
so Dave, welcome. How are
Thank
you?
you. I'm doing well. How are you?
All right. How are you doing during this quarantine?
Well, I have a 6-year-old and a 3-year-old, so just like everybody else, a little nutty. The sunny
little?
days are a little bit. The sunny days are better than when it's raining, and got to keep them inside. But we're making do.
We got a tough week this week with
Yeah,
I think I saw 3 rainy days.
Yeah.
Get out, really?
Yeah.
Ew.
Well, it's got to be like I used to work at a summer camp, and they said the motto was rainy days are supposed to be the best days at camp.
Is that like when it rains on your wedding? It's good luck.
Yeah,
That's just-
sure. Anything to make you
It's the
feel better,
BS
I
they tell
guess.
you. I see.
Hello to Dan Kreinus checking in on YouTube.
Dr. Dan
Kreinus.
Kreinus.
I didn't say Mr. Dan Kreinus. I said Dan Kreinus. I
I
figured
know,
there
you
you
just have
go.
to throw it in.
Give the man his due, Dr. Dan.
Congrats, Dan.
Dr. Dan Kreinus, host of the Leader of Learning podcast, checking in on the YouTube. Nice. So AJ, why don't you set this up? Set the stage for us. Tell us a little bit about Dave, and let's get this train going.
Yeah. So for anybody who's not watching the YouTube and listening to the podcast, there's another voice with us today. We have a good friend of mine and a Coffee EDU participant, Dave Frangiosa, with us. He's a teacher of 14 years in both urban and affluent settings here in New Jersey. And we really have Dave on here because big time, Dave's been performing action research on grade reform since 2015. And if you've been in New Jersey, you've probably seen Dave present for science teachers conventions in New Jersey and at ESET 2 Metro, which took place a couple years back in Passaic, I believe. And Dave has been creating online PD courses for Eduscape and has written new course curriculum centered around science. So Dave, welcome to Podcast PD.
Thanks, AJ.
No problem, and thanks for being with us. So let's get this party started. So Dave, tell us your philosophy on grade reform.
Well, so I've been teaching, like I said, 14 years, and I've taught in urban districts. Currently, I'm up at Pascack Hills, which is a high achieving district. And I've been teaching the special ed population collaborative courses, and I've seen a big disconnect between achievement. And early in my career, I was, when I was teaching without resources, if these students had resources, if they didn't have to go to jobs after school, if they, there was a whole bunch of ifs. I was like, maybe they'd care more about school. And then when I got to Hills, I realized that wasn't the case. And like, I kind of misinterpreted them not caring about school. They cared about school. They just didn't have the resources to achieve. And so getting into it, it seemed like, especially the population that I taught, the collaborative struggling learners, which I teach physics. We have 14 physics sections. 6 of them are struggling learners. They're collaborative IEP sections. So you're talking over 40% of what I teach are students who need a little extra help. And so it kept coming back to grades. So what was getting in their way is, what's the point in trying when I'm just going to do poorly? I'd rather fail and not try than try my best and get a D. And so didn't matter what I told them. Didn't matter whether I said, okay, focus on the skills, the grade will come, I'll work with you. It wasn't until I actually removed the grade out of frustration, it wasn't anything other than that, that I actually started seeing really some progress. And then from that point, I started digging a little deeper, and, it's 5 years later, and I've learned a whole lot more, really dove into the research, not so much other people's models, but, reading original texts like, Bloom's taxonomy, which is widely misinterpreted, cognitive load theory, Ruth Butler, her research on feedback and how to provide feedback. Also some sociology studies talking about just approaching things from a strengths perspective instead of a deficit model, where traditional grading, you're talking about you're doing poorly because these are all the things that you can't do. And now the strengths perspective is like, okay, great. These are the things that you can do. How can we grow them from here? So what are the next steps to get you to that next level? And then once you're solidly there, what steps can we take to further develop? So really, it's all about positive feedback and incremental growth over time. So, how we get there, it's a little different than what students and parents are used to, but it definitely has done very well for my students, especially during this time. They're not feeling that stress of that grade hanging over them. And what we're doing right now for them is independent practice, and what they're getting from me is just feedback. So it's really freed them up to actually just try to do things on their own. So
That is such a stark contrast from what I'm being asked to do.
oh yeah, what are they
Teaching
asking
new
you to do?
content, giving grades, assessing for, content retention. So, it's business as usual, but in the virtual environment.
Well, for me, this is business as usual. This is how I've been training my students in September. Is anybody trying to make a shift now and asking students to do something that they haven't been used to since September, it's not going to land well. So if you've been teaching content and you've been looking for retention, to shift to a model that I'm doing now wouldn't be successful either, because they don't have any of those habits in place, and might actually be more stressful for them. So it's not something that I would recommend to do midstream, but I think in light of these events, it's made my students' life a whole lot easier. It's made my life a whole lot easier.
So Dave, let's talk about your classroom, right? So
Yeah.
What does this look like coming into September, when I'm sure you have a reputation in your school where the kids know you? I'm sure they know what you're trying to do and what your class is going to be like. I'm sure there's word of mouth. So in September, walk us through the way you introduce this to your students. That's something different, because I know we've spoken, and I know a lot of other teachers are kind of buying into this here and there, but not a lot are practicing this with the standards base in their classrooms. So what does it look like for you and your class in September?
So in September, when they come in, we spend the first probably 15 minutes just talking about, this is going to be different than any class that you've ever had. This is what we're looking to do. When you're here, you work, and we're just trying to get a little bit better over time. And we jump right into a questioning activity, because in science, that's one of the most important things. So I just want to get them in that mindset of, anytime they walk in my door, they're doing work. And so I really don't get into all the specifics of this until I've established that my classroom is a workspace. Because once they have in their mind that maybe today's not a work day, that's in their mind every time they walk into your room. And you're going to have to take the first 10 or 15 minutes just to say, okay, no, today's really a work day. So I established that for the first week, and just the importance of the scientific process, which we'd be doing in any grading model. Right. That's something we're doing. Investigations, we're doing labs, we're asking questions, answering questions. So we just lay the foundation for that. And then once they get comfortable with me, then we start talking about, okay, now you know what I expect. And that's usually happens in week 2, or, you know what I expect. Here's how you're going to be assessed. The whole year is laid out for them. So I give them a grade translation chart. So how the standards will be translated to an actual grade, because whether people know it or not, even if an entire school district is gradeless, behind the scenes, they translate that to a GPA. So I'm not going to fight something that's inevitable anyway. So I know they care about the grade. We're going to minimize it, not take it away. So I put that out there, and I say, okay, I'm going to help you get whatever one of those grades you choose. I'll lay out the path for you. I'll coach you towards that. I'll give you the feedback. It's up to you to decide whether you're willing to take the steps. And it just really changes that relationship from that adversarial relationship, where now it's me and you arguing over a grade, over that deficit model of, this is why I took points, and them saying, well, I deserve those points, to more like a coach in the classroom, where it's just okay, great. Here are your strengths. And then here are the things that you can do to improve those strengths. And, over that first week when we're talking about questioning and the scientific approach, and they actually start to see that, and they're getting that feedback and getting used to it. So then when I show them this model, it's just like, okay, yeah, that makes sense because I've already experienced it. So I really let them kind of dive in and experience what I'm talking about before I lay out the entire model. And the other thing that we do at the beginning of the year is we expect everybody in our room to be a novice. We don't expect them to come in knowing anything. If they do, great. But, we teach it from the ground up. So, and in our rubrics, we actually show that. So we block out everything above the developing level. So we say, okay, right now we expect you to be a beginner. We're targeting developing, right? So we want to move you one step. So we block everything above that. And our focus is solely on how do we move from step 1 to step 2. And for them, it's such a small step that there's no pressure. And so they say, okay, this is manageable. And then once they see that that's manageable and they gain some skills, so this is the whole idea of schema. So it's harder to build knowledge than it is to expand it. So once I can get them to try, once I can get them to build that initial knowledge, I can expand it from there. And so that's kind of what we do, is we structure the class in such a way that they have to take these steps. All right. And so we do that from day one.
David, when you first started this, and I always use the term pushback, but what type of questioning did you get from, co-teachers, administration, parents, and what does that look like even today?
Oh, it's much different today. But admittedly, when I started, I had a very flawed model. I knew why I was doing what I was doing. I didn't know the best way to accomplish it. But I did everything right leading up to the implementation. I actually gave a couple months of lead time. I had parents come in for information nights and said, this is why I'm doing this. And I laid out everything from that fear of that perfection paralysis that we were talking about, AJ.
Mm-hmm.
Students won't submit something if it's not perfect. That grade was holding them back. So, I laid all that out. I told them what I was going to do, how I was going to do it, how they could track their students' progress, and that this was a work in progress. And if things needed to be adjusted, they'd be adjusted to reflect what we were trying to accomplish. So before I even implemented the model, whether they agreed with me or not, they trusted that I was trying to do what I thought was in the best interest of their students. So I had some parents that were, how dare you do this in their all-important junior year? You're going to be the reason they don't get into college. So there were, I got some pushback. My co-teachers thought I was crazy. Some of them still do. But to be honest with you, I really didn't care because I know what I'm doing is what's right for my students, for me personally. At least the students that I teach, they've responded very, very well. So in the beginning, students didn't understand it, didn't like it. I switched mid-year, which was a terrible idea. But I'm glad I did because I have a lot of great data. But regardless of that, at first they're just like, this is the dumbest thing ever. I hate it. And then by the end of the year, they're just like, okay, it makes sense. I get what you were trying to do. I probably wouldn't have done as well if you didn't do this. And so even within that flawed model, I got a lot of good feedback to where it's just like, okay, I'm onto something. I have to keep going. And so then I took the summer, I kind of retooled everything. And at that point, one of my coworkers, Elise Burns, who's fabulous, she saw, because we teach in the same room, and she sees my students, and she knew what they were doing in the first half of the year. She saw what they did in the second half of the year, and she's just like, I want in. And so from that point on, her and I started working together and just having somebody else to bounce ideas off of. I kind of hit a plateau when I was doing it on my own. And then having somebody else to say, yeah, here's why that's not a good idea. Or, I think this will work. And then just talking it out about like why you're trying to do certain things, like that really pushed this model over the top. And, and it wasn't until the third year that we actually had, we were using a generic rubric that was, pretty much how independently students can do work, which is like, it's so hard to assess. And so we went to more concrete language about using I can statements. So, I can do this, I can do, and so we had, it was like 30 I can statements. And then what we started to do was put them together, and well, they have to do this one before they can do that one. And so we started to order them and then condense them. And so right now we're at 9 standards. So, and they're based on the science practices. And so we track 9 standards throughout the year. And so now we can really communicate. We can walk them through a learning progression. So at this point now, I get virtually no pushback. All right. But I can also communicate exactly why I'm doing this. I have the research to back it up. I've been doing it for 5 years. I've collected my own data for 5 years. And I mean, from everything from how students enjoy the class to their stress levels to, so, and I sent that over to AJ. I mean, I've surveyed almost 400 students and I did a grade analysis on almost 1,000. So, I'm making sure that what I'm doing is actually improving learning. On top of that, the pace of our course, and the depth that we're going into each topic. So, I'm actually teaching more in depth. The kids are producing higher quality work, more independently. So everything about it is, it's so much better for me personally than what I was doing prior to this shift. So, and when students see that and parents see that, and, there's a lot less pushback now. So.
It sounds good.
Okay.
Go ahead, Stacey.
I was going to say, I mean, it sounds great. And I'm just wondering, you said that you go deeper and it affected the pace of your course. How did it affect the pace of your course? Because I know that sometimes the fear is the deeper you go, the slower you go. So you're not going out as broad because you have to go so deep.
Well, so here's the difference. We slow down in the beginning. So we make sure that they have a firm foundation of skills. And we don't move on until they have that foundation of skills. So going back to that whole cognitive load, it's easier to expand the skills. What was happening, and it wasn't until we actually slowed down and started blocking out the higher levels of the rubric that we actually had this success and picked up the pace. We make sure that students know how to conduct an experiment, how to formulate a response to a conceptual question, how to write a conclusion, how to solve problems. And we have a very systemized approach. So if they don't know how to do something, they go back to that system and they walk through. And basically we built our model around 5 words. First level is try, right? So kids are never going to improve if they don't try. And then the second level is explain. Why are you doing what you're doing? So just getting them to think about why they're doing what they're doing, that's huge. So we make sure, that's our developing level. We make sure that they can explain to me, I'm choosing this answer because it's related to the law of conservation of energy, right? And so now, okay, great. You have a reason for why you chose this answer. And then we say, okay, what does the law of conservation of energy state? So now they have to explicitly say, well, the law of conservation of energy says energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change forms. So now the answer is. So now we're going from that explain to now they're explicitly explaining that. And so, once you get them in that habit, And you don't have to say, okay, now for this topic, here are the things that you need to do. They just have that framework. And so then with each unit, the way we address content is they have to take a content mastery quiz where they have to get 100. So it's the vocabulary and the understandings for that unit. So if you look at content, as you go through, and we had originally had content standards for each topic. And what we noticed is level 1 was they knew the definitions, right? And so if that was level 1 for every single one of them, and they didn't know the definitions, they couldn't progress through that standard. And so it was unfair to say they didn't have a skill if they didn't know definitions. So we kind of tease those apart. And we make sure that they know the definitions and understandings, and they have to. That's the foundational concepts, right? And so just that whole systemized approach, they have to know those within the first week of the unit, right? And they're given every definition at the beginning of the year. So if they want to work ahead, they know they have to memorize these. They know they have to know these going in. So they can work ahead, which has allowed us to go a little faster. And even if they don't work ahead, they know that, okay, I have to know these definitions in a week, and then we're going to start applying them. And so, the depth, the pace, it's picked up from there. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there was an old adage that someone shared with me when I first started coaching. She was like, start slow to go fast. And it sounds like you're, and as an elementary school teacher, one of the things that we've talked about on the show, excuse me, is, really building that foundation in the first 6 weeks for us. So being responsive classroom, doing those first 6 weeks, and kind of, you're just doing it in one content area with a depth of knowledge that's going to far exceed anything that I'm ever going to get to in 1 year. But that's awesome.
Thanks.
I got a question, David.
Yeah.
So you've been doing this for a few years.
Yeah.
5 years. And everything you've said so far speaks to the success. And I'm sure there's been, some stumbles along the way. You mentioned how you had some issues at the beginning. Can you talk a little bit about how this has impacted the people that you teach with? So has this spread to the science department? Are there other areas and other teachers that are on board based on what sounds like a lot of positive data? So have you been instrumental in changing grading where you are?
So the model that we're running right now, it's me and my coworker, Elise, who are doing this. We have probably about 20% of our staff that are experimenting with alternate assessment. So, and we differ in a few ways. So there's other people who are experimenting with redo policies, which that's probably one of the biggest knocks that people have on alternate assessment and standards-based grading. And I'm right there with them. We don't do reviews, so we're I'm against that, except for, building that foundational knowledge. So somebody has to continue to practice that stuff until they have that foundational knowledge. We have probably about 20% of the staff. The first person in our district to do alternate assessment was this guy, Matt Marone, English teacher at PV. And he was doing an open classroom, and him and I, philosophically, we wanted to get to the same place, but our approaches were very, very different. I was the first person in my building. He was the first person in his building. But, right now we have about 20% of our staff, 15 to 20% of the staff doing some sort of this. I know I have 2 other colleagues that I work very close with that are implementing portions of this. One of the other physics teachers is doing lab standards. He does it just for lab, but he's an AP teacher. And so that's a different animal. So that's very content heavy. The pace of that is much different. And so, but Elise also teaches AP as well. They just have differing philosophies, but he does it for the lab standards. And then one of our chemistry teachers, she's in the process of trying to get something like this off the ground. But, she only has one section of the chemistry course, and she teaches our research in molecular genetics. So she's hammered with that. And so the timing issue, it's a lot of front loaded effort. And so there's a lot of people who aren't willing to do that piece of it. I think people would be more open if I said, here's a product, all you have to do is run it. But like that front loaded effort of just repurposing assignments and, building out that learning progression and the learning language, like I said, we're 5 years in. So there's a lot of people who aren't willing to invest 5 years, so there's some people that think it's a good idea. There's other people who say there's no need for it, but it varies on who they teach and what they teach. So
to piggyback on Chris's question about other people within your department, has this moved outside of your department, say to social studies or language arts or
language
math?
arts? Well, so like I said, this started with language arts at PV, so it's expanded in that department. The math department, they're doing more with like that whole redo philosophy, but they are experimenting with alternate assessment. So I can't call it standards-based grading. We'll just, there's a lot of different types of alternate assessment. So, and like their model is definitely different, but, it's just different.
It's just different. Yeah. But I like that every department is kind of taking a whirl on some type of alternative assessment, and not making it this archaic Scantron. Bruce isn't here anymore, but I know he just had a big Scantron thing that he posted on Facebook, or using a more traditional set of assessment where everyone's doing the same test on the same day, the same expectations. So,
and in terms of testing, we approach that very differently as well. So we give, it's essentially a quiz every Friday. We call it a checkpoint, being that their last assessment is what they're based on. Their grade is going to be based on. Those checkpoints are not worth anything. They'll never factor into their grade. So it's a 20-minute quiz. They take it. They don't turn it in. I go over it immediately. So what we found over doing this is that the immediate feedback was the most important thing. The quicker you could get students the feedback of what they needed, what steps they needed to take in order to improve, the better the success was. So these checkpoints happen every Friday. They take them. We go through the entire thing on the board. I said, if you made this mistake, like circle it and write, whatever it is. Like, so I'll give them helpful hints. And so I point out not just like the perfectly correct response. It's just like, okay, here are the common mistakes. If you did this, this is probably where you made your mistake. Check that. And, and then our tests, we have unit tests just like we normally would. They're a lot shorter. We only have one question per standard. And we use the concept of low floor, high ceiling. So if you've ever read any of Joe Bowler's work, and that's something that she promotes, that whole low floor, high ceiling. And so it's something that any student can engage with, but the students who really understand what's going on can expand on it. And so same thing there. We update the standards at the end of every unit. And those we actually collect, we write our detailed feedback on it, give it back to the students. I like that before I give it back to the students, I actually like to have them come in and meet with me. We do a lot of conferencing, and I like to go over it with them and say, okay, this is what you did. This is how you can improve that for next time. And so we update the standards with each unit test. Every unit has a project as well. So when I talked about the 9 standards, we have 4 that are assessed through those tests. We have 3 that are assessed in labs. and then we have 2 that are assessed through projects. So that's how we're getting our 9 standards, and they're all based on the next gen science practices. So, and then as we go through unit to unit, our target increases. So like, in unit 1 and 2, maybe we're targeting developing. When we get to unit 3, we're targeting proficient, right? By unit 5, we're targeting advanced or whatever it is. And that also depends on course. So we run the same standards from AP and down to our collaborative class. So our expectation just varies. Physics is physics. The skills are the skills. So, the rate of progression changes with the ability of the student. So that's how we modify that, and that's how we modify our support and we modify our expectations.
So tonight we're talking with David Frangiosa, and the conversation is revolving around grades and standards-based grading, as he shared over the course of the first part of tonight's episode. We want to let you know, if you're joining us in the chats and Twitter or on YouTube, if you've got questions for David that you'd like us to pose to him, you can put those in the chat, or you can go to podcastpd.com/join, and we'll welcome you into the show if you'd like to come on and ask David your question face to face, so to speak, in this COVID live streaming world that we live in.
Stacey, do you use standards based in the elementary classroom?
We do, but it seems to be a completely different animal from what David's talking about, just because, for us, it's district wide. It is our report card. So it's not just, an alternative way to offer assessment or grades. But we never, when we switched to standards based, I was never a teacher, save for 1 year when I worked in a completely different district, and I only lasted there 1 year. Our philosophies did not mesh. I was never a teacher who gave out letter grades to kids, which makes sense because until this year, I'd only taught 3rd, 1st, and 2nd grades. So there's not a lot of letter grades that should be going out to children of that age. But yeah, we do have a standards-based report card, and like Dave's saying, it is all about the progression and recognizing the capacity to move into that, like each developmental step. So an area where a kid might be having some difficulty in September, there's always going to be the capacity to grow and expand, as Dave said, on that knowledge and information. And hopefully by the end of the year, with work, good instruction, and support from home, kids can be achieving and proficient. What's interesting though is, our system in my district is 1, 2, 3, which kind of like levels it out, and takes away the traditional ABC grading system, right? Because most kids, the elementary level also don't fail. But my son's school district, when they were in elementary school, they had a 4-part grading system. And then that kind of you're a 4, oh, you're an A, you're like an above average student. Like you could play those mind games. Whereas like when you reduce the number of progressions in each of the standards, then you're kind of removing some of the, likening it to letter grades.
See, I actually went the other way. We have 5 levels of progression. And so I did away with numbers altogether. Once the system allowed me to, and I'm very fortunate, my school has allowed me to change my grade book. They're very progressive when it comes to that, very supportive. So my Genesis no longer has numbers in it. So our levels are beginner, developing, proficient, advanced, and expert. And like I said, we have a grade translation chart. So at the end of the year, in those 9 standards, so we went through with what would our ideal student, what would their learning progression be throughout the course of our year? And we set that as the A. So that's our ideal student. So this is what they should achieve in each standard by June. And so then we said, okay, what is the minimum that we would accept from a student in order to give them credit for the course? And that became our D. And so then we went through and we did every grade like that. And we built out this grade conversion chart based on those different progressions. So there's no direct translation. They can't play that game. Now, even when we did it with numbers, it still wasn't a direct translation, but you're right. People would be like, oh, I got a 3 out of 4. It's a 75. Well, no, it's not. It's just like, that's the level of progression that you're hitting. And as you're getting to those higher levels, the jump between steps gets bigger and bigger because they have more skills. So, it's what might take them a couple of weeks to go from beginner to developing might take them a couple of months to go from proficient to advanced. So, they can't play that game. Yeah.
Dave, what does this look like? You mentioned how you've got this grade conversion and that helps you translate grades at the end of the year. Does this also apply during the marking periods or semesters, during, say, interim report time? And the part two would be, I'll let you answer that, then I'll come back with part two. Go ahead.
Okay. We only do semesters, so we don't do quarter.
Okay.
So so basically we said, where should they be in their progression by the end of semester 1? And then if they're at that point in the progression, it's usually pretty accurate within half a letter a grade. If they continue that rate of progression, they'll end up with this grade. So we've kind of set that mid-year mark based on that learning progression, because we know what materials we're putting out there. We know how we're teaching to each level. So we know where they should be at each point in the year. And so it's easy for us. And that's why this really had no bearing. The whole pandemic had no bearing on my grades, is because I knew where they should have been on March 13th when we had our last day of school. So for us, we're just shifting our benchmarks to, well, as long as they were there when we had face-to-face meetings and they maintained that through the end of the year, so that was an easy shift for us. All right, part two. Sorry.
Under normal circumstances, when we're not, learning virtually, what impact has this had on things like parent-teacher conferences during the year? And has this opened the door, and this might be part three, but I'll throw it in now. Has this created the opportunity to have students maintain anything like a portfolio throughout the year where they've got evidence to support what they're meeting and what they're doing? How does that look?
Yeah. So parent meetings have gotten way easier, just for the simple fact that I can now say, this is what we're expecting your student to do. This is what they can do. These are the steps that they need to take to get to this level. So it's real cut and dry, and there's no mystery to it at all. And the good thing is, now I can actually generate interventions through our child study team and guidance way earlier in the year. So, I'm usually in talks with CST and guidance October, November, saying, hey, I've recognized that this student is falling behind. We need to put in interventions now, rather than it being the end of May and saying, hey, what can we do to get this kid across the finish line? So
Right.
from that perspective, I can identify when a student is really struggling. And, I've identified students, like I said, that early, and some of them have taken the interventions and done well. Other ones have ignored them and they've wound up failing the class. And so what was part three again?
The opportunity to have students, do they maintain portfolios, or how are they collecting evidence?
Yeah. So they do have a portfolio. And so what we do is we have evidence of every different type of work. So we have those 9 skills. All right. And so they have to have their most recent lab report. They have to, which is annotated. So they have the previous week's lab report, so they can actually see it. This is a living document. It's not just It's not just let's just keep adding work. We want to see their most recent evidence because that's really what we care about. We want to see where they are in their progression. We don't need to see where they started. All right. So we have the two most recent labs, both annotated. We have peer reviews. So they're reviewing each other's work. We have our projects. So we do engineering design challenges where, and we go through that progression as well. So they have to keep a log of all that, and they have to have their project report. We also have them keep a journal and all of their checkpoints for that unit. And so between all of that information and their unit test, we have enough to have a clear picture of where they are. And we use those during our conferences. Like they'll bring those in, we'll sit through and we'll go through every standard in one sitting, and they have it all in a portfolio. The other thing that we do is we have minimum course requirements. So as part of that portfolio, they have a sheet that has, they have to do a certain number of labs per unit, a certain number of peer reviews. They have to take every test. They have to do every project. They have to pass all those content mastery quizzes. And so they have this, this minimum requirement checklist. And once they complete that, they're eligible for credit in the course. If they don't do all of that, they don't pass the class. And that gives us enough information to make a professional judgment on where they are in their learning progression. All right. And, that typically doesn't even come into play. So like students are doing most of the work, and we have that in place because, and what I tell students is, I know you're an athlete or you have a job or you're in the play or you have a concert or whatever it is. It's a busy week. Skip this week's lab. As long as you've done every other one, missing one, if that's the exception and not the rule, it's not a problem. And I'm sure every teacher would be reasonable like that. If a student's doing everything, you give them a pass if they miss one assignment. So we kind of built it into our model.
That's good to hear.
Yeah. Yeah. So they have that, but students tend to do everything because once they get used to getting feedback, they want more feedback.
Right. Now, you also shared with us you're building out this this great resource, this great website, which we will pull up for those watching on YouTube, and we'll have you walk us through it for the podcast listener. But we're going to go to the quote unquote the phones, and we'll see what happens when we take live questions. So you ready,
All right.
David?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Let's welcome in friend of the podcast, Al Spiegel. What do you got for us?
Hey, everybody.
What's going on, Al?
I'm using my God-given initials, AJ, because I want to be like you. So I'm using the Jonathan this week. So
Wow.
Notice that it's AJ Spiegel. So I was thinking as David was talking, I saw in the chat too, the colleges dictate all this. I like the idea that, that we can grade based on what you could do, not so much, based on a number. But, how many of the kids will say, well, what does this mean out of a 4.0? I have a, if I don't get a 102 average, then this school's not going to take me. And it's just, there's this fear, I have to get a good grade. I have to get, even though if I asked half my colleagues, would they even know, does that number represent what the kids have learned or didn't learn or the work they can do? It's just this, in some sense, an arbitrary number. But we're so fixated on that because I'm not going to get a scholarship. I'm not going to get into this school. I'm not going to get anywhere in life because my number is what it is. Excuse me. And I think that's such a big fight that, I think if I said to the people that I work with, we should go to something like this, which I believe, I think they'd have a stroke because it would just be, it's so mind blowing because we and I'm a Bergen Catholic, David. So I'm right down the road, and that same highly competitive, like your kids are going to college, and it's not just they're going, tier 1, top tier, Ivy, that kind of stuff. And it's almost like we're bound, like our hands are tied. We can't do anything creative with grading because, what college is going to say, well, what does that mean on a 4.0 scale? That's the first question we get. What's that on a 4.0? And that's a huge fight that we, that I don't know how we win.
So there are districts. There's the New England Consortium, and I actually visited a school, Windsor Locks, which the entire school is going standards based. So I think at this point, their juniors have never seen a grade in their career. All right. And there are a bunch of schools who have signed on with the New England Consortium that said they will accept these transcripts. But I don't know if you were on before. Every transcript is converted to a GPA, even if the students don't see it. So,
okay.
So even if a school says that they're gradeless, behind the scenes, they convert it to a GPA that they sent to schools. So the schools don't care how they get the GPA as long as they can see the GPA.
Gotcha. Okay.
So, and check into the New England Consortium, and they have a lot better information on that than I do. But it hasn't been an issue. And the one thing that I will tell you is, yes, grades are still a concern, but they're not the focus anymore. So what winds up happening, and I did a grade analysis on 1,000 students. So between my classes and my colleague Elise, who's running the same system as I do, and she teaches the AP students, so what we found is, on average, the grades after we shifted to this model have gone up half a letter grade. So students are responding and doing better grade-wise as well. And, the initial thought might be that we're grading easier, or that, we're allowing redos, or, people have misconceptions about being gradeless. And a couple of things. We're not any easier on them. We're actually, as I discussed before, the standard that we're holding them to is higher. They're doing more work. We're going more in depth with the work. And we don't allow redos. Anything that would ever count towards a grade, they don't get to redo. And there's a reason for that. And I know that a lot of the standards-based proponents will probably, be mad at me for saying this, but I'm completely against the idea of redos for grades, because that's exactly what it is. It's for a grade, not for learning. And it's completely counter to cognitive load. So if you have a student who doesn't do well on a test, and then you say, okay, you have to jump through all these hoops and retake that test while you're learning new material, now they're behind on 2 content areas. And then they're going to be behind on the 3rd because they're not going to know that. So they're perpetually behind. So the idea of redos for me is counter to a learning progression. So go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, this really, I think, brings into the fold the idea of true summative versus true formative assessment, where what are we grading versus what are we not grading? And earlier you talked about the weekly quizzes that they're not graded, but you give it to them, they get that instant feedback, and you can continue to progress.
Yes. So, formative assessment in the classroom, that is the most valuable thing for student growth, right? Formative assessment with immediate feedback. If you can get there, that's where your students are going to see the most progress. All right. So, I think the hurdle that most people face is they're so content driven. My content's important. They need to know this. And I don't disagree with that. I teach physics. So, physics is a lot of content, so I don't think there's anybody who can tell me
it's not that bad.
No, look, hey, I love it, but there's not another content area that can say, hey, we have to do more. You should see the list of things, and we wrote out all of those all of those I can statements for our entire curriculum. And I have probably about 20 pages of things that students are supposed to be able to do. And so what we did is we boiled it down to a common theme. How can we separate this? What, what's overarching between all of these topics? And it's the science practices. All right. And so we actually track skills throughout the entire year. All right. Where the content is important and they do need to know that. And that's handled in a different way. And they must pass those foundational concepts in order to get credit for the class. So that's how we manage the content piece. But in terms of grading, if they don't know how to construct an argument, they're never going to do well on a content test that asks them to construct an argument. So if they gain that skill in March, you can't go back and retest the content from September. So, we felt that it was a clearer representation of what they were doing if we separated out content and skill and only graded on skill or practice.
It's an interesting
David, what are your
thought.
thoughts on Amy's comment here in the chat that she agrees that I do agree with redos at the middle school level, but that it wouldn't need to be allowed on all assignments. So in your mind with grade reform, can we differentiate in the different levels of education between elementary, middle, and secondary?
So here's the thing. Redos are necessary if you are trying to build a skill, right? So people need direct instruction and repetition to build content knowledge, right? That's just it. There's no other way to do it. So if the redo is to reinforce learning and, it's to build that conceptual understanding, absolutely. But if it's solely to increase a grade, there's no room for it.
Right. And Amy, thank you for your question.
Yeah, and I have to, to Amy's point, I know there's a middle school teacher that I used to work with who, there's not much that we're doing to change our grading system in my district, but he changed up some of the things that he was doing in his teaching and assessment within the unit. So I agree with you. Redos in certain content area do kind of create that backlog. But when you're within the unit, and he was a language arts teacher, so a redo or even withholding the grade until feedback was taken in by the student, that's essentially what he started doing, right? So like the kids would start writing their pieces within the unit, and he wouldn't give them a grade. He'd give them feedback throughout, and it was constant. And there were, you have your check-ins. His check-ins weren't necessarily always on a Friday, but there were a lot more of them than the typical conference that you would have in a regular writing workshop. And he was trying to really be meaningful and deliberate with his feedback in a way that he hadn't been prior to. And not until they took in that feedback did he feel comfortable giving them a grade. And then, so, you could have multiple pieces throughout the unit. And again, you're building on those skills and you're improving your craft as a writer. But withholding the grade is what really got kids to kind of take in the feedback that they were receiving from their teachers. Because I think a lot of times, and I'm sure those of you who teach at, Al, you said you teach at the higher ed level as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
Right. Like I remember when I was in college, like I would just look for my grade. Oh, it was an A, boom. I didn't care how many other red comments, blue comments were on the margins or whatever. It didn't matter, and that's really what he's trying to instill in them, that it's about the feedback and the learning, and the grades will come if you're still using them, will come after the learning has come as well.
Yeah, that's a great approach. I do need to clarify something. We do reassess because we have these skills that go throughout the entire year. So, we start the year with electricity and magnetism. So, and they get an assessment at the end of that on, how they write a conclusion. Then when we move on, to kinematics, they get assessed in that skill again. So we're reassessing. They're not doing the same content over and over. That's what I mean by redo. We're reassessing the skill. We're not redoing an assignment just to improve a grade. So like,
Right.
and I think that's where we need to make the distinction. Is it a reassessment of their level of performance in a skill, or are we redoing the same content? Right. And like both are valuable in different situations.
I teach, one of the graduate classes I teach is in supervision. And what I want students to be able to do is to be able to observe class, like that's the skill I want them to learn. So they go out and and I have them do an actual observation, because not so much that, the theory is important and all that, but I want them to be able to do that skill. And how I assess that is looking at the report that they write, and that's and it's pretty much, if you do that and you understand how to do it and you apply the theory correctly, then that's an A. That's it. Like I'm more concerned about preparing them for a career in doing that skill than anything else.
So Dave, when you think about feedback, what does feedback look like in your classroom? Is it face to face? Is it just through a chat? Whether it's through forms? Like what does feedback look like when you give to the students?
There's a whole bunch of different ways. And so we do whole class feedback, we do individual, we do conferencing, we do small group instruction. So it's pretty much, it all depends on the scenario, how they get their feedback. They'll submit assignments through Canvas, and I'll put feedback on their assignments in there. So some of it is, digital. A lot of it is face-to-face. A lot of it is small group instruction. And then, like I said, there's nothing wrong with whole class feedback. So when you're giving this descriptive feedback, it becomes very time consuming. That's the other part of this, is that you need to find ways to manage that. And so sometimes we don't evaluate the entire lab submission. So we'll say, okay, you have to write up the whole lab just to practice it, but I'm only going to give you feedback on your experimental design. Next week, I'll give you feedback on your conclusion. All right. And on the next one, I'll give you feedback on your data analysis. Or, so the other way you can do it is, I'm giving this third of the class feedback on this one, or like it all depends on where you are in the year, what the students need, because, I have some students that are they're killing it. Like they're doing awesome and they need very little feedback from me. So, they don't have to hear from me as often. And it's just a couple little clarifying things, where there's other students that are struggling that may need a little more guidance. And so I'll focus on them a little bit more. But in the beginning of the year, it's pretty much, the way that we kind of ease into the year, we start with just doing conclusions. And so we give everybody feedback on conclusions until they can do that well. And then the students that are still struggling with that, I'll give them feedback on their conclusion and their experimental design, where the people who have actually progressed to the point that I need them to, they just get feedback on their experimental design. So it really all depends on what's going on in the classroom, what the assignment is, what the students need.
Are the kids brave enough to come to you for feedback before they turn in work, or they just kind of wait for it to be the time where feedback is due?
I don't. I encourage them to attempt it on their own. I was like, the more you do on your own, the better my feedback will be, because it's truly your work, right? If they're coming to me for feedback and then giving me my work, that's really not helpful for them. So like, I really encourage them to do this stuff independently, and they're just like, yeah, that makes sense. And so, but the fact that there isn't a grade attached to it, they don't have that fear of the negative impact. So they're just like, yeah, all right, I'll give it a shot. And like, when we start the year, I say, what's the worst that happens? You have to talk to me, And so like, and just getting into that mindset, they're really, they're not shy about asking for feedback. but they are more willing to do stuff independently.
I have to say, I find when my kids come to me and they ask for feedback, it happens a lot more in writing than other content area, but a lot of times, I guess, in social studies too, with like projects and stuff. But when they ask about taking a specific approach, or does this sound better? Or does this sound better? That's when I know that like my teaching has begun to stick, because it's not just like I'm doing it this one way, or I don't care what that feedback is. It's like I'm really thinking about this one part and how to improve this one part. And I always find it really powerful too when kids like instead of like I know you and I see the value in it too. So I'm not knocking it when you say like I'm giving them feedback on their conclusions, or I'm giving them feedback on this one particular part. But I always like throwing it at my kids and saying, you let me know where you want feedback. Do you want feedback on your beginnings? Do you want feedback on your conclusion? Do you want your feedback on your transitions? Like, then I know that they're taking a hard look, a critical look at their work, and they're kind of thinking about like, what area of growth do I want to focus on in this one particular assignment, this one piece, or in this one area.
Yeah.
And
oh, go ahead.
I was saying, and Amy also commented that feedback is the most important during the process. If the majority of the feedback is in the final product, you've missed your moment as a teacher.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. In those small group instructions, they're getting guidance, and that feedback is different based on the levels. Like so your struggling learners, they get more guiding questions. So what do you think would happen if? Have you tried that? Like and then like, and as they do that, then you say, okay, great, now try X, Y, and Z. Where your more high achieving students, you're going to ask more leading questions and kind of probe and challenge, and so that the feedback and the interaction, it varies from student to student, level to level, day to day. And I mean, but a lot of us do that without even thinking about that. But what we've done is we've created a scenario where the students need that feedback in order to progress, and they can't just say, well, I got an A, so I'm doing well, because that's like the biggest myth, the biggest lie that teachers tell to students is, a kid who's getting an A in September and October, they look at that and they say, hey, I'm doing great. And they don't look to improve anything. And then, in December, maybe they're getting B's. And then like, in February and March, they're getting C's and D's, and they said, well, I was doing so good, but they never improved, And so like when you're using letter grades as feedback rather than, okay, here's where you're at, this is what you can do, and these are the things that you need to do to get better, it totally changes the dynamic.
Now,
So
Dave,
Dave,
something that...
Sorry, Chris.
Go ahead, AJ.
I don't know. No, take it. Go ahead.
Oh, go.
No, I was going to say, I know this is just scratching the surface. I know there's so much more that goes into this idea of grade reform and standards based and alternative assessments. But I think one of the things that you're doing right now to really help people kind of understand this is through your website that you're creating. So I don't know if you want to actually discuss your website. It's a bit.ly, so it's bit.ly/guide to grade reform. And what are you doing with this site?
So just as I create resources, I'm throwing them up there. So the landing page, I did a presentation down at the New Jersey Science Teachers Convention, and a lot of people were asking me why I made this switch. And so it was hard to answer in a tweet. So as you can see, it's 3 pages of my ramblings about why I made this switch. And so then from there, I started making a few infographics just to kind of give an overview about the path that I took. So, just how to approach a transition to an alternate assessment, and using this as a guide. So, that from the whole communication piece, understanding what you value as a teacher, how to create a learning progression around what you value, creating that language that describes the learning progression, all the way up through implementing your model. So it's just meant to be like a little resource for people to, have an overview. By no means in an infographic can you just follow that and implement a standards base, but it can give you some ideas. And anybody who wants to, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to help. There's a video that I talk about in my essay, and it's Mark Rober. He is a former NASA engineer, one of my favorite YouTubers.
I love his YouTube channel.
He's amazing. He's absolutely amazing. But he did this TED Talk on the Super Mario effect. And basically,
I've seen it.
Yeah, it's awesome. About so he basically tricked 50,000 YouTubers into taking a coding challenge. And it kind of sums up that he took away fake internet points and people tried less. Where if he didn't take away those points, people tried more, and the people who tried more were more successful. It's a really good video. So I just put it there. Articles. So as I collect articles, I'm going to put those in there. So this was actually a piece Ed Week had interviewed me and one of my students for. So I'm going to start collecting some articles. I wrote one for ASCD. Hopefully they pick it up. And hopefully I can throw that up there. And then just, I'm going to put like some student quotes and testimonials, and then I have some slide decks of presentations that I did with some more of this information. And then finally, I just have all the citations for all the research. So if people want to dig into this on their own, like, don't take my word for it. Go to the primary research, read it yourself. That's what I did. Like, I talked before about how people misinterpret Bloom's taxonomy. I mean, I've been teaching for 14 years and I've heard about the hierarchy, and then when I went back and read it, there's no hierarchy. It's a progression. Nowhere does he talk about lower order thinking or higher order thinking. He talks about, knowledge and understanding and how that's the foundation to progress through to application. And, so that's always what, I believed in as a teacher. And then just that interpretation, after I read the original document myself, really kind of confirmed that. So I really encourage everybody to read the research on their own and come up with your own conclusions.
Nice. And again, the website is bit.ly/guide to grade reform. And that's guide with a capital G. There will be a link to it in our show notes out at podcastpd.com/72.
All right. So, David, I just want to thank you for joining us tonight and sharing all of the great work that you're doing. You go to a lot of PD, you write a lot of things, and you have a lot of information to share. Where do you find you get your best PD?
I really like working with my colleagues, sharing ideas, just be open-minded. The people who are in the classroom next to you are doing like some really good stuff, and, steal as much as you can from them. Conferences are good. The New Jersey Science Conference, I always pick up stuff there. I'm trying to get out to NSTA, the regional in Pittsburgh, if it'll be going on in October. We'll see. But I like conferences. Coffee EDU, that's great. Always sharing good ideas there. Yeah. Just talking to like-minded people. Actually, even talking to people who disagree with you, just why do they disagree, and just having to defend that. Like, sometimes it makes you rethink what you're doing and how can you change it, or maybe it solidifies your stance. So just, talk to as many people as you can, and, talk to the people who are teaching not just the same thing that you're teaching. I've learned a lot of stuff from ELA teachers, history teachers, math teachers. So, just get outside and talk to people.
Well,
Now, Dave, for people who want to talk to you, how can they do that? How can they connect with you?
Yeah, just at David Frangiosa. I tried to make it easy. You can hit me up on Twitter, and I'd be more than happy to share a lot of stuff with you, guide you in whatever whatever direction you need to go.
Awesome.
Well, David, thank you for talking with us this evening. We really, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
On that note, we are going to say goodnight. Say goodnight, Christopher.
Good night, Christopher.
Say goodnight, AJ.
Good night, AJ.
Say goodnight, David.
Good night, David.
Good night, Podcast PD.
All right, that'll give me a few seconds on my edit point. We're still live on the YouTube and the Periscope. Thank you to everybody who came out and chatted with us in the chat, whether you were on YouTube or Periscope. We really appreciate it. Share the love. If you're not subscribed to the podcast, head out to podcastpd.com/go on your podcast listening device. I think we'll be back next Sunday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern with more Podcast PD. So that'll do it. We'll see you next time, everybody.